All right, video 2 on operant conditioning. In classical conditioning, we learn to associate one stimulus with another, but this is only one type of learning. Another type of learning is operant conditioning. And in operant conditioning, people and animals learn to do certain things and not to do others because of the result of what they do. In other words, they learn from the consequences of their actions. B.F. Skinner was a psychologist from Greenville. He actually went to Furman, and we've talked about him a little bit before, but he helped pioneer research in operant conditioning. Operant conditioning, again, it depends on the use of reinforcements and a schedule to execute them, and we're going to talk about what that means. And operant conditioning can be applied to help people or animals learn to combine a series of simple steps or actions to form complex behaviors. And this would be an example. And again, operant conditioning, people and animals learn to do certain things because of the results of what they do. A good example of this would be like training your dog to sit. The dog sits and it gets a treat. And so the dog learns that if they sit when you tell them to, then they will get a treat. So they're learning from the consequences of their action. And voluntary responses are conditioned. So these aren't, involuntary responses like in classical conditioning. And his experiment demonstrated what we call reinforcement. And reinforcement is the process by which a stimulus, in Skinner's case when he was doing his research, food for rats, it increases the chances that the preceding behavior will occur again. And after several reinforced responses in Skinner's experiments, the rat that was in his Skinner box started pressing the little lever quickly that would give him food until it was no longer hungry. In operant conditioning, it doesn't really matter why the person or the animal makes the first response that is reinforced. It can be by chance. But what matters is the reinforcement. And there are there are four types of reinforcers that we're going to talk about. Primary reinforcers are reinforcers that function due to the biological makeup of the organism. And some examples of these would be food, water, adequate warmth. These are all primary reinforcers. And we don't need to be taught to value food, water, and warmth. Secondary reinforcers, however, the value must be learned, and they initially acquire their value through being paired with established reinforcers. For example, money, attention, and social approval. All of these things are secondary reinforcers. And they can also be positive or negative. Please don't confuse this with good or bad, though. Positive reinforcers increase the frequency of the behavior they follow when they are applied. And negative reinforcers increase the frequency of the behaviors that follows when they are removed. So positive simply means adding to, negative means removed, not good or bad. And I highly encourage you to get a screenshot of this. So rewards and punishments are also used in operant conditioning. Many people believe that being positively reinforced is the same thing as being rewarded, and that negatively reinforced is the same as being punished. But there are some differences, particularly between negative reinforcement and punishment. Rewards, like reinforcers, increase the frequency of a behavior, and some psychologists do not use the term reward interchangeably with the term positive reinforcement. Skinner preferred the concept of reinforcement to that of reward because the concept of reinforcement can be explained without trying to get inside the head of an organism to guess what it will find rewarding. And while rewards and positive reinforcers are similar, punishments are quite different from negative reinforcers. Both negative reinforcers and punishments are usually unpleasant, but negative reinforcers increase the frequency of behavior being removed. Punishments, on the other hand, are unwanted events that, when they are applied, decrease the frequency of the behavior that they follow. And sometimes punishment can be a problem. it's not the ideal way to deal with the problem. Most psychologists do agree, and you can read through these on your own. So the effectiveness of reinforcement, how well this operant conditioning is going to work, actually depends on the schedule of reinforcement, which simply means when are we going to do this and how often are we going to do it. Continuous reinforcement is the reinforcement of a behavior every single time the behavior occurs. So for example, when rats in the Skinner box receive food every time they press the lever, that's continuous reinforcement. And new behaviors are usually learned most rapidly through continuous reinforcement, but sometimes it's not always practical or even possible to reinforce a person or animal for a behavior every single time it occurs. The alternative to continuous reinforcement is partial reinforcement, and this is when a behavior is not reinforced every time it occurs. A good example of this would be people who regularly go to the movies but may not enjoy every single movie they see, but they continue to go to the movies because they enjoy at least some of them. Behaviors learned through partial reinforcement tend to last longer after they are no longer being reinforced at all than do behaviors learned through continuous reinforcement. And when discussing interval schedules, if the amount of time, the interval that must elapse between reinforcements of a behavior is greater than 0 seconds, the behavior is on an interval schedule of reinforcement. And there are two types, fixed interval and variable interval. In a fixed interval schedule, a fixed amount of times, like for example 5 minutes, must elapse between reinforcements. However, a variable interval schedule means that it doesn't really matter how often, or not that it doesn't matter, but there is no set time intervals or frequency. In a ratio schedule, if a desired response is reinforced every time the response occurs, then there is a 1-to-1 ratio of response to reinforcement. If, however, the response must occur more than once in order to be reinforced, there's a higher response to reinforcement ratio. For example, if a response must occur 5 times before being reinforced, the ratio is 5-to-1. And again, you have fixed and variable ratio schedules. In a fixed ratio schedule, reinforcement is provided. Reinforcement is provided after a fixed number of correct responses have been made. And in a variable ratio schedule, reinforcement is provided after a variable number of correct responses have been made. And extinction in operant conditioning, we talked about extinction in classical conditioning, which is basically just the end of a behavior when the stimulus isn't being presented anymore. And in operant conditioning, it results from repeated performances of the response without reinforcement. So if you tell your dog to sit and you train him with treats over and over and over, and eventually you stop giving him treats when he sits, then he might stop sitting when you tell him to, and that would be extinction. So let's talk about some applications of operant conditioning. If you've ever tried to teach someone how to do a complex or difficult task, you probably know that the best way to teach this task is to break it up into parts and teach with each part separately. And when all the parts have been mastered, they can be put together to form a whole. And this is called shaping. And it's a way of teaching complex behaviors in small steps. And chaining is combining the steps of a sequence to progress towards a final action. It can go backward or forwards, and it can be used to teach complex behavior patterns in animals. Program learning is based on both of these concepts, shaping and chaining. And again, it was developed by Skinner. And it assumes that any task, no matter how complex, can be broken down into small steps. And in program learning, a device called a teaching machine presents the student with the subject matter in a series of steps, which is called a frame. They can be mechanical handheld devices. They can be books or papers or worksheets. But today, however, they're most likely to be a computer. And it doesn't punish students for making errors. Instead, it reinforces correct responses. And that's it. Thank you.